You're listening to Gateway to E-commerce, a podcast by ClearSale. In this series, global e-commerce leaders discuss challenges, best practices, new tech, and secrets to success. And now, your hosts, Raphael and Denise.
Hello, this is Denise, and I'm joined today with Raphael, and we're going to talk about selling during the holidays, which for me is a really exciting piece of information to talk about. It's something that now, as we're heading into the holiday season, if you haven't started thinking about these different aspects and getting your site ready, it's time to start now. And so we're going to talk about just one aspect of that today, and that's really about the sales process and everything to do with completing that sale, because marketing and all these different aspects could be involved, but really we're going to hone into one piece of that today. So as we look into the holiday season, Raphael, this year is going to be even busier than the past. And so thinking about that, what are some of the aspects that merchants need to consider?
Hi, everybody. I'm happy to be here again. And Denise, you hit the nail on the head when you said that we got to get prepared, right? By this time of the year, it's important to be very prepared to what's next. And I think, as you said, as sales increase so much during this period of the year, preparation is the key. And on our side at ClearSale, it's interesting because this is the most expected part of the year for us. Very frequently, we have to hire a bunch of people to help us going through these times of the year. And this is very exciting. I mean, while for a lot of companies and people, this is a time of the year where they're resting, they're rethinking, they're strategizing. For us, and I think it's the same for the retailers and our partners, it's time to work hard. And
so true.
For me, and for me, it's actually the favorite part of the year, because that's when we can put the most of our capabilities and skill sets on the line. And I'm sure it's exciting for you too.
It is. There's always this great sense of urgency when, I deal with the partners mostly, but then of course we're working with merchants as well. And there's always this rush to get to the finish line. And it seems like that time frame becomes shorter and shorter and shorter because more merchants are onboarding and just they're trying to do more to maximize their site, make it more competitive, and thinking about all the security aspects, including fraud on that back end. So it's a fun time for sure. It's always really good conversations that proceed quickly.
Yeah, definitely. And I said about preparation, but I think this year we have a specific interesting scenario where anything that has to do with predictability is in a completely different perspective. What other aspects you feel like are relevant, and why so many merchants and so many players in the e-commerce industry are always talking about holiday season? What is it that is so important about it that people get so focused on it throughout the year?
Well, beyond people being ready to spend money, and that's exciting because average order values are generally about double for most merchants. When we look at across the board, average order values of about $215 is what we see during the holiday season. It's about 50% more than what merchants see. So based on that alone, it's different buying habits, but you've also got that purchaser, such as myself, who waits until the last minute to make purchases, and then they're wanting to rush those orders and get them in time for the holidays. So we've definitely got deadlines in mind for the shoppers as well, which is kind of a unique situation because it's not always the case. Sales and other things need to drive that urgency during other parts of the year. So given that, we take those things into factor, and it starts to become a little bit more confusing for the merchant to decide, is this sale a good sale or not? I know that you've talked about that a lot with merchants and trying to figure out, what is the benchmark that you're at? What is your fraud rate? What is your false decline rate? Could you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's important for merchants to understand and be able to calculate.
Yeah, sure. So I think, first of all, you're right when you say that this makes the life of merchants a little challenging during this time of the year, because at one hand, consumers are in a hurry more than ever. I mean, they have a deadline, they want to deliver the gifts or whatever. And on the other hand, we are talking about a higher volume. So the period of the year where you would entertain the most time is also the time of the year where the consumers are actually more in a hurry, which makes, again, the life much harder. But speaking of fraud, as you said, I think it's also interesting this time of the year for a fraud perspective, because we are talking about a lot of things changing, right? So what you should expect for holiday season is not, even on a KPI perspective, as you said, is not the same as you should be expecting for the rest of the year. Because the sales increase so much, the amount of fraudsters or the amount of transactions that are actually fraud attempts does not increase as much as the good sales. And the reality is that what that does is the fraud rates are actually a little lower because there are so many good customers. And again, fraudsters do not get attracted by promotions, right? Like they're not going to be paying anyway. They know how much busy are the merchants, so they try to take advantage of it. But in the end of the day, the increases in sales are usually higher than the increases in fraud attempts. And as you said, KPIs must be expected to be different. And in my point of view, you got to be perfect during this time of the year, meaning the less fraud you allow happening, the better, and the less false positives, the better also.
I think that's a great point, because when you talk about that amount of fraud being less, I think a lot of times merchants are taken aback by that because they think more sales, more fraud. But then you talked about the fact that there are more good customers. There are more, valid customers out there willing to spend money. But you touched on the point of false declines, which I think is so important as well, because you have to consider even more that false decline piece because of the fact that you've got better customers coming to the table, and the last thing you want to do is turn them away. And I think that is one point that we constantly talk about with merchants, because they don't think about that piece of it, and that purchase and that customer could get lost in the fray a little bit more, because you've got busy customer service on the part of the merchant and everything else going on, and that could lead to a bad experience.
You talked about a lot of people just think about the transaction itself being lost, but I think you brought a good point when you said be losing the consumer for the lifetime value of this consumer, right? And I think there are other costs also involved with false declines, and I know that you've talked a lot about it with partners and merchants, right? So it's not only the specific transaction, but actually a bunch of other sources of costs that are related to people declining orders that they shouldn't.
Agreed. So stepping back a little bit, what is a typical chargeback ratio and a false decline rate? What can merchants expect if they don't even know their numbers? Where do they start?
Well, first thing, I believe that this is a question that will depend on the size of the merchant, will depend on the segment the merchant is inserted. So for instance, furniture, if you look at one side of it, furniture is one of the less risky segments, while electronics or jewelry could be understood to be some of the risky ones. So that answer actually depends a lot on different stuff. But I would say the most important is start to measure it, right? So let's say we are talking about chargeback as a percentage, chargeback rates as a percentage of the total sales. And if you have too much above 25 basis points, for instance, I think it's already a good moment to start thinking about it, because I feel like depending on the segment and how much you have recurring customers, you may be a little higher than the average. But again, it's a case-by-case discussion. And when it comes to clients, I mean, the approval rate as a percentage of the transactions, then it's a different story, because people not necessarily measure it in opposed to the chargebacks that they receive it on a notification and a report from the card processing. So for declines, for approval rates, my main advice here is making sure you are measuring it, and you are measuring it considering the combination of all the sources of decline divided by the total order attempts. And if it's giving you much more than 3-4% of decline rate, which means 97% of approval rates, then you would have a problem. So those are just ballpark numbers.
You brought up a good point, and this made me think, because it's simply a percentage, right? So when you look at chargebacks, merchants always know their chargeback, it seems like, because they feel the pain. They see it as a negative on their balance sheet and their statement from their processor every single month. And if you look at the holiday season and you're getting additional chargebacks, so you talked about that 25 basis points, and I think that's a good point to consider, because it used to be, people would talk about that 1%, and now it's more of a 9 basis points that they're thinking about. But that's really when it gets to be like to the point of no return, because if you get to that point with a processor, they're likely to drop you or charge you additional fees as your stuff is not in check with their standards. So given that, I think it's important to obviously know that piece, but also think about the flow of the orders during the holiday season. So if you have a high flow of orders and then it drops off the following months, but your chargebacks come in, that can get out of whack very quickly, right?
Definitely. That's one of the challenges of the holiday season, depending on how you measure the chargeback rates and how your card processing measure your chargeback rates. Because as you said, I mean, you have a November and a December very hot in terms of number of orders and sales. And then the chargebacks will take a while to be notified, right? And when you get those chargebacks, perhaps you're comparing to months of January and February that tend to be a little slower. So let's say if you had 0.5% of chargebacks on a month that is the double of the month where the chargeback is coming, if you measure it comparing the chargebacks that you received in January versus the sales of January, 0.5% may turn out to be 1% because it's the double of the volume, and then the half of the fraud attempt or the chargeback rate numbers. So that's very interesting.
And those numbers can sneak up on you. That's the scary part. What you do now is going to determine what happens for you in the future. So it makes it even more important to consider making some changes around fraud.
Yeah, I agree. And not only that, but also if you allow fraud from happening, you mentioned the 1% threshold. So let's say in a given month, in or outside of the holiday seasons, if you allow like close to 1% of chargeback to happen, the reality is the fraudsters are also a network. They talk to each other and they will let everybody know that it's easy in your website, right? So you're not only worried about this particular month in which you face the 1%, but the chances are that the next month is going to be even worse. And then that's the challenge, because how will you react, as we were saying, being too tough, being too conservative on your declines, on your approvals, can be also a big problem, especially in a holiday season. So think about the consumers being on the edge and being anxious to get their goods, their products.
So
and it's not going to sound good, right?
I agree. And so I think that brings up a good point with like the whole customer service piece, because if you do have customers on the edge, the first thing you do is have a front line of defense where you've got somebody answering the phone or answering emails and reaching out to those customers to try to mitigate that anxiety and make it a better experience, and buy some time if needed on a delivery or whatever the case might be, because all of these things are intertwined. If you're not getting your orders out in time and they're not getting delivered on time, you've got unhappy customers that could result in chargebacks. So that goes even beyond the fraud aspect. It's thinking about all these pieces and making sure that your team is equipped. So, I think that training would be a good thing, even if it's just a refresher, and going over some customer service do's and don'ts, and outlining some different scenarios, and even role playing, and giving those customer service frontline people an opportunity to practice before it gets crazy, so that and giving them the pride that they're the first line of defense and they're the ones that can help make the company more profitable at the end of the day.
Yeah, and when you tell me that, and I'm sure you have a lot of information about it and had a lot of conversations about it, that triggers me to think about the same aspect on the point of view of fraud, right? So if we want to train and practice with our customer service reps on how it looks like during holiday seasons, based on how it looked like in the past, or you using experienced reps to train the new ones, I feel like fraud is the same. So because, as we said, there are many aspects of fraud prevention that change during the holiday seasons, I feel like we got to focus whatever we do with our fraud prevention strategy and try to base it on previous experience of the same period of or other sales peaks, and there are a lot to be considered in this matter, right? So you gotta think about the different types of fraud and what is specific about the holiday seasons when it comes to risk, right?
So true. So true. So I think that's kind of takes us to the interesting side of it and looking at the fraud itself. And we were talking prior to this, and you were mentioning that people are asking about the new types of fraud that are emerging, and we kind of chuckled because fraudsters are fraudsters, and they've got different tricks, but they're really under the same methodology when it comes down to it at the end of the day. When we start talking about that actual fraud, then what are some of the sneaky things that merchants have to start to consider and watch for?
I think, as you said, the fraudsters do not change that much their behavior. I mean, they may increase their activity. They may try to take advantage from the fact that they know the merchants are busy, but not necessarily they change that much their behavior. But the reality is that the good customers do change their behavior, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about people traveling, so shipping and billing address may not be matching. We're talking about people not necessarily getting the phone, working, waking up later. So if you need to get these people on the line, it might not be easy. We all know how busy our houses when families is in, how busy the house our families may become, right? And gifts. I mean,
Trying to
gifts
be
mean
sneaky. Yeah.
yeah. Exactly. So
Sending it
mean
to somebody else's address or whatever the case might be to hide it from the kids. Yeah.
exactly,
Got to
exactly.
keep
So
Santa going.
yeah. So Santa is busy as well, right?
That's right.
So the reality is there are a lot of behaviors that during holiday seasons are behaviors expected somehow by good customers that in other periods of the year are actually red flags for fraud. So that's
Mm-hmm.
why I talked so much about the false positives, right? Because you got to understand what is the behavior during the holiday seasons, and by that, and with that, you gotta not affect or not try your best not to affect these processes for people buying gifts, people delivering to different addresses, people buying for the first time. I mean, we didn't talk about it, but how many merchants use this part of the year to offer promo prices, and that attracts a whole new bunch of customers that never bought online, but they are not willing to go to brick and mortar during this time of the year, and they are buying for the first time. So I never saw this email address or this customer in a different transaction, and now I'm having to make a decision again on the busiest part of the year for me as a fraud prevention manager, for instance. So it's challenging. I mean, it's a lot of things happening at the same time.
It is, and it's almost mind-boggling to think about. And you mentioned that whole first-time buyer. It'll be interesting to see how many more first-time buyers come on board after getting used to hearing about being able to purchase online. And it's kind of the perfect storm here with the people not wanting to get out of the house. So I think we'll see even more of that going into the holiday season.
I agree. I think people that e-commerce as a channel has a lot of convenience, and even though a lot of people don't feel necessarily safe on this environment, the fact that some of us were forced actually to test it and to have this experience in buying online during this year, I think it may trigger us to see a very interesting behavior throughout the holiday seasons in 2020.
I think one thing that I get asked a lot, especially for that small to mid-tier merchant that hasn't, really relied on fraud prevention in the past and might be thinking about going into it for the future, is, how quickly can I get up and running with a fraud prevention system? And I think if you're building it on your own, you've got to think about a longer time frame because you've got to do a lot more testing and things like that. But if you're talking about a pre-integrated outsourced company like ClearSale, it's something that can be done pretty quickly, especially if you're on an e-commerce platform that's pre-integrated.
Yeah.
So I think those are things to consider as well for the merchant, because it's something that you don't have to think, well, I have to put that off till next year. because I didn't have enough time. There's plenty of time now to get something in place.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you know better than anyone how much the e-commerce platforms know about it. And they, I mean, virtually pretty much the second half of the year, they are pushing, these alternatives. They are trying to advertise solutions like ours or many others that would be helpful during this part of the year so that you know, not only in advance, but actually if you have a last minute concern, you will have some of those decisionings or some of those solution providers ready to help you. And that has been a focus of the e-commerce platforms in the last couple of months, right, Denise? As I know you talk a lot to them.
It has. It seems like shipping and logistics, marketing, and now fraud are three pillars that they talk about constantly. And there's a reason why.
Yeah.
Those are all
Yeah.
the things that you need to make things successful.
Yeah, definitely.
I think we covered a lot today. It's been interesting talking about the different aspects of the holiday impact on sales. I hope this gives everybody a little bit of food for thought. I hope you can join us for next episode. It's going to be a roundtable discussion. So Raphael, myself, and then Sarah and David will all be together again talking about trends for 2021. So thinking ahead once again. So if you'd like to know more about how to prevent e-commerce fraud, visit our website. It's clear.sale. And if you have questions, please catch us at podcast@clear.sale. Thanks for listening to the Gateway to E-commerce podcast, where global e-commerce leaders discuss challenges, best practices, new tech, and secrets to success. Subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or Google Play, and leave us a review, please. Thanks so much.
For more e-commerce insights, visit us on our website at clear.sale.